It was 3 days to Christmas, and the town buzzed with an air of strained festivity. The sun blazed high in the sky, and the heat pressed down like a heavy blanket. Jessica sat on the wooden stool in Bright Glory's salon, the rhythmic tug of combs and the smell of singed hair filling the small, crowded space. She winced as the stylist, Auntie Bissy, pulled at her thick curls, trying to tame them into sleek braids. "Ah, Jessica, this hair of yours will make someone sweat like Christmas goat," Auntie Bissy said, fanning herself with a piece of cardboard. Jessica didn't reply, her mind elsewhere as she stared out the window. The salon, a modest space painted bright pink, sat just a short walk from their house. Through the open door, Jessica watched the kids in the neighborhood run past, their laughter echoing. It was a rare sound to her these days. Her sisters were at their grandmother's, leaving her alone in a house that was anything but peaceful. Suddenly a commotion broke her thoughts. Madame Susan, their nosy neighbor, burst into the salon. Her face was flushed, her chest heaving as though she'd been running. "Jessica! Jessica! Come quickly!" she cried, her voice trembling. Jessica spun around on the stool. "What happened?" "It's your house!" Madame Susan exclaimed, clutching her wrapper tightly around her. "I was hanging clothes outside when I heard shouting. Your mother and father. It sounds bad this time. Screaming for help." Jessica's heart sank. It wasn't the first time she'd heard about her parents fighting, but the urgency in Madame Susan's voice chilled her. "The door is locked," Madame Susan continued, her voice cracking. "We tried to knock, but no one's answering. You're the only one around. You have to come now." Jessica didn't hesitate. She leapt off the stool, her half-done braids sticking out awkwardly. Auntie Bissy called after her, but Jessica was already running, her slippers slapping against the hot pavement as Madame Susan trailed behind her. As she neared the house, Jessica's chest tightened. The air felt heavier, the kind of heaviness that precedes something awful. The neighborhood seemed eerily quiet, as though everyone had retreated indoors to avoid what was happening. She reached the front door, panting, and froze. The screaming had stopped. Her throat tightened as she called out, "Mama? Papa?" Her voice wavered, the silence that answered more unnerving than the screams had been. Her hand trembled as she pulled out the spare key from her pocket. Madame Susan stood a few steps behind, her hands clasped nervously. Jessica unlocked the door and pushed it open. The scene that greeted her was one she'd never forget. Her mother lay on the floor, her dress torn and stained with blood. Bruises marred her once smooth skin, her face swollen and streaked with tears. The smell of iron and sweat filled the room. "Mama!" Jessica screamed, rushing to her side. Her mother's eyes fluttered open briefly, tears pooling in them as she tried to speak, but her words were drowned by the sobs that racked her body. Jessica's legs felt weak beneath her. She turned her head sharply as she heard movement. Her father stood in the corner, his shirt untucked, his face unreadable. He sighed, the sound cold and detached, before slipping his phone into his pocket. Without a word, he stepped past Jessica, past Madame Susan, and out the door. Jessica stared after him, her mind a whirl of anger, confusion, and fear. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving only the sound of her mother's faint cries and the ticking of the wall clock. Jessica pressed her hands to her temples, trying to steady her breathing. Her gaze fell to the blood on the floor, a stark reminder that this was no ordinary fight. "Jessica, what do we do now?" Madame Susan whispered, her voice trembling. Jessica didn't answer. Her mind raced with questions she didn't dare speak aloud. Why had her father left so suddenly? Why hadn't he called for help? And most pressing of all, would her mother survive? The silence stretched long and heavy as Jessica's eyes darted to the table. Her father's Bible lay open, a single verse underlined in red. The words blurred in her vision, but the eerie symbolism was clear. Jessica clenched her fists, determination hardening her features. She wasn't sure what was coming next, but she knew one thing. This was just the beginning.